Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the hushed marble corridors of a Mughal palace just before dawn, where the air is still cool and the world feels like it's holding its breath. You're not supposed to be here, of course. Wandering royal halls before sunrise isn't exactly on the approved guest list, but somehow you've made it past the guards, past the heavy doors, and into a space that smells faintly of sandalwood and polished stone. Around you, shadows stretch long and thin, broken only by the soft flicker of oil lamps. And while this all feels calm and poetic, let's be honest, if you actually lived here as a servant, you'd already be awake hours ago, probably carrying something heavy and hoping not to trip in front of someone important. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move forward slowly, your footsteps barely making a sound against the smooth stone floor. The palace is not asleep, it's simply quiet in a very intentional way. A few attendants glide past you, their movements practiced and nearly silent, as if they've rehearsed this hour 1,000 times, which, to be fair, they probably have. In the Mughal court, routines were not just habits, they were almost sacred. The emperor's morning began well before the sun appeared, and everything, every curtain drawn, every tray prepared, had its place in a carefully choreographed sequence. A mainstream historical fact here, Mughal emperors, especially figures like Shah Jahan and Akbar, were known for their disciplined daily schedules, often rising before dawn for prayer and reflection. This early rising wasn't just about productivity, it was deeply tied to spiritual practice, particularly the Fajr prayer in Islam, which takes place before sunrise. So while you might be thinking about hitting the snooze button, the emperor is already halfway through his morning routine. You pass beneath a series of carved arches, their patterns intricate but softened in the dim light. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint clink of metal, perhaps a servant arranging a tray of drinking water or preparing garments for the emperor. Clothing here is not just clothing. Layers of fine cotton, silk, and sometimes even cloth of gold are laid out with precision. And here's a slightly quirky tidbit. Some Mughal garments were so delicately woven that European travelers claimed a full outfit could pass through a ring. Whether that's entirely true or a bit of exaggeration is, well, let's just say historians still argue whether those accounts were literal or just impressed tourists getting poetic. The air carries a subtle fragrance now, rosewater most likely. It lingers lightly, not overwhelming, just enough to make the space feel fresh and intentional. Scent was a big deal in the Mughal world. It wasn't just about smelling nice, it was about atmosphere, about setting a tone for the day. You imagine someone, somewhere in the palace, carefully sprinkling rosewater onto the floors or into the air, like a quiet signal that morning has begun. As you continue, you notice how the palace seems to wake in layers. First the attendants, then the distant rustle of fabric, then the occasional murmur of voices kept deliberately low. No one rushes, no one panics. Even urgency here is elegant. It's almost suspiciously calm, like everyone agreed in advance not to ruin the vibe. You pause near a lattice screen, its carved stone patterns allowing you to glimpse another corridor beyond. Through it, you catch sight of a small group of attendants waiting, heads slightly bowed. They're positioned with careful spacing, not too close, not too far, each person aware of their place in the invisible hierarchy that governs everything here. Mughal court etiquette was famously precise. Even standing in the wrong spot could be seen as a subtle insult. So yes, if you were actually part of this world, you'd probably spend a good chunk of your day worrying about exactly where to stand. Relaxing, right? Somewhere deeper within the palace, a door opens softly. You don't see who emerges, but the atmosphere shifts just a little. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but the attendants straighten ever so slightly. The emperor is awake.
You don't rush toward the sound. That would definitely get you noticed, and not in a good way. Instead, you linger, letting the moment unfold. The early hours of a Mughal emperor's day were intentionally private, time for reflection, for prayer, for preparing the mind before facing the responsibilities of rule. And those responsibilities were no small thing. Governing a vast empire required constant attention, diplomacy, and decision-making. So this quiet beginning, it's not just peaceful, it's necessary. You take a slow breath, noticing how the coolness of the stone beneath your feet contrasts with the faint warmth of the lamps. The sky outside is still dark, but there's a hint, just a hint of change, like the world is gently stretching awake. Soon the emperor will step out into the gardens, into the carefully designed paradise of the charbagh. But for now, everything remains inside, contained within these marble walls. And as you stand there, half hidden in shadow, you realize something a little amusing. For all the grandeur, all the power, all the layers of protocol, the start of the day here isn't so different from anywhere else. People wake up, prepare, move quietly through familiar routines. The only difference is that here, every small action carries the weight of an empire. No pressure. You linger just a moment longer, listening to the soft rhythm of the palace waking up around you, before slowly, almost instinctively, beginning to move toward the light that will soon lead you outside.
You drift further along the corridor, the quiet now feeling almost like a companion rather than an absence of sound. The palace seems to guide you forward gently, as if it already knows where you're meant to go next. The air shifts slightly, cooler, fresher, and you realize you're moving closer to an open space. Somewhere ahead, beyond these carved walls and shadowed arches, the first hint of morning is beginning to gather. Silk curtains hang loosely at the edges of tall doorways, their edges barely stirring in a faint breeze. As you pass one, it brushes softly against your arm, light as a whisper. You pause for a second, mostly because it feels dramatic, and also because you're not entirely sure if touching royal curtains is allowed. Probably not. You decide to keep moving, just in case someone is silently judging you from behind a lattice screen. Attendants continue to appear and disappear in your periphery, each one focused, composed. Some carry small trays, perhaps fresh garments or simple breakfast items like fruits and flatbread. Others hold long-necked vessels filled with water, likely for washing rituals. Cleanliness in the Mughal court was not just practical, it was deeply tied to both comfort and religious practice. Ablution before prayer, known as wudu, was an essential part of the morning. So, while you're still waking up mentally, the emperor has already completed a full cycle of preparation that's both physical and spiritual. A mainstream historical note: Mughal emperors were known for maintaining refined personal hygiene routines, often involving scented oils, rose water, and carefully managed bathing practices. This wasn't just luxury, it reflected a broader cultural emphasis on purity and presentation. You pass a slightly wider chamber now, where a few attendants stand waiting in stillness. No one speaks, no one fidgets. It's almost impressive how motionless they are. You try to stand still for a moment too, just to blend in, but after about 5 seconds you realize you would not survive this level of discipline. Someone would definitely catch you shifting your weight awkwardly. At the far end of the chamber, a faint golden glow begins to replace the dim lamplight. Dawn is arriving, slowly but surely. The transition is so gradual, it feels almost deliberate, like the sun itself respects the palace routine. You step closer, and the polished marble beneath your feet reflects the growing light in soft, muted tones. And then, for a brief moment, you catch a glimpse of him. Not directly, never directly, but through the reflection on the marble floor. A A figure moving with calm precision, surrounded by just enough attendants to assist, but not enough to disrupt the stillness. The emperor's presence isn't loud or dramatic. It's centered, controlled. Every movement seems measured, as if even walking is part of a quiet ritual. Here's a more curious tidbit. Some accounts suggest Mughal emperors placed great importance on the timing of their first public appearance of the day, often aligning it with specific moments of light or prayer. Historians still argue whether these timings were strictly symbolic or simply practical, but either way, it added another layer of meaning to an already structured routine. You don't linger too long on the reflection. It feels like one of those moments you're lucky to witness, but shouldn't overanalyze. Instead, you follow the direction of movement, keeping a respectful distance as the corridor begins to open. The architecture subtly shifts here. The ceilings rise higher, the air feels less enclosed, and the scent of rosewater blends now with something greener, fresh leaves, damp earth, maybe even early blossoms. The palace is giving way to the garden. You step through a final archway, and the space ahead unfolds quietly, without announcement. No dramatic reveal, no sudden brightness, just a soft expansion of light and air. And as your feet carry you forward, you realize you've left behind the enclosed stillness of the palace and entered something far more open, yet just as carefully controlled. The garden is waiting.
You step fully into the garden, and for a moment, you almost forget you're supposed to be quietly observing imperial routine, because this place feels less like a garden and more like a carefully arranged dream. The air is cooler here, touched by the faintest hint of moisture rising from narrow water channels that stretch out in perfect lines before you. Everything is symmetrical, deliberate, almost mathematically calm. This is the charbagh, a classic Mughal garden design divided into 4 sections by water channels, inspired by Persian concepts of paradise. A mainstream historical fact, the charbagh layout was meant to reflect the Islamic vision of heaven, described as a garden beneath which rivers flow. So yes, technically you've just walked into a symbolic version of paradise, which is quite an upgrade from your average morning commute. You follow one of the stone pathways, noticing how each step aligns perfectly with the geometry around you. The garden doesn't sprawl, it organizes. Trees stand at measured distances, their branches trimmed just enough to maintain order without losing their natural shape. It's the kind of place where even the plants seem to respect the rules. Water flows quietly beside you, not rushing, not splashing, just a steady, gentle movement. The channels are shallow but precise, guiding water from one section to another. Somewhere ahead, a small fountain releases a soft, rhythmic trickle. It's not loud enough to demand attention, just enough to exist in the background, like a built-in white noise machine designed centuries before anyone called it that. Honestly, if this were a modern app, it would be called Imperial Garden Sounds for deep sleep. You pause near a cluster of flowering plants, their scent subtle but layered. Jasmine, perhaps, maybe roses. The Mughal court had a deep appreciation for fragrance, not just for personal use, but for entire environments. Gardens were curated not only visually, but aromatically. Different plants bloomed at different times, ensuring that something was always in season, always adding to the atmosphere. Here's a slightly quirky detail. Mughal emperors were known to experiment with plant combinations and even import exotic species from distant regions. So, some of what you're smelling right now might have traveled hundreds, even thousands of miles to be here. Imagine being a plant, minding your business somewhere in Central Asia, and suddenly you're relocated to an imperial garden. No pressure, just symbolize paradise. You notice movement ahead again. the emperor continuing his walk. His pace is unhurried, almost meditative. You adjust your own steps to match, not out of obligation, but because it just feels right. This isn't a place for rushing. Even time seems to slow down here, stretching gently between each footstep. A few attendants remain at a respectful distance, their presence barely noticeable unless you're looking for it. No one interrupts, no one speaks loudly. The garden itself seems to set the rules: quiet, balance, attention. Birds begin to make themselves known now, their soft calls weaving into the soundscape. Nothing sharp or jarring, just light occasional notes that rise and fall with the morning air. You glance upward and catch sight of one perched along a branch, completely unbothered by imperial presence, which, honestly, is a level of confidence we should all aspire to. And then there's the symbolism, everywhere, but never overwhelming. The 4 sections of the garden, the flowing water, the carefully chosen plants, all of it reflects ideas of order, harmony, and divine balance. But it doesn't feel heavy. It feels calming, like everything is exactly where it should be. Historians still argue whether these gardens were primarily spiritual spaces or displays of political power. Were they meant to bring the emperor closer to a sense of divine peace, or to subtly remind visitors of his control over nature itself? Standing here, it feels like a bit of both. Peaceful, yes, but also very clearly designed, very clearly intentional. You walk along the edge of a water channel and glance down at your reflection, slightly blurred by the movement of water. For a second, it feels like you're part of the garden too, just another quiet presence moving through its symmetry. The light is changing now, slowly warming. The sky has shifted from deep blue to a softer shade, and the marble structures around the garden begin to catch the glow. It's subtle but noticeable. The world is waking up, one layer at a time. You take a slow breath, letting the scent of flowers and fresh water settle in, and continue forward, following the path as it leads deeper into this carefully crafted calm.
You continue along the pathway, your steps naturally slowing to match the quiet rhythm of the morning. The emperor moves ahead with the same measured calm, and now, almost without noticing, the space begins to fill, not with noise, but with presence. Figures appear at a distance, like gentle additions to a painting that was already complete. Courtiers. They don't rush in or crowd the path. Instead, they position themselves carefully along the edges of the garden, each one maintaining a respectful distance. Their clothing is refined, but not overly bright in the soft dawn light. Flowing fabrics, muted tones, the occasional shimmer of embroidery catching the rising sun. You get the sense that even their entrances are timed, as if the garden itself decides when they're allowed to appear. A mainstream historical fact: Mughal courts operated on strict hierarchies, where rank determined everything from seating arrangements to how close one could stand to the emperor. Even during informal moments like a garden walk, these invisible rules remained firmly in place. So while this scene feels relaxed, it's actually a quiet performance of order and structure. You drift closer to a cluster of courtiers, careful to remain unnoticed. Their voices are low, almost blending into the background sounds of water and birds. Conversations here don't interrupt the piece, they become part of it. You catch fragments of discussion, trade routes, agricultural reports, perhaps even a line of poetry. In the Mughal world, governance and art often overlapped. A policy decision might be framed with the same elegance as a verse, which honestly makes modern office emails feel a bit underwhelming. One courtier gestures subtly with his hand, and another nods, their exchange brief but meaningful.
No raised voices, no dramatic debates, just quiet communication layered with implication. It's like watching a group chat where everyone is extremely polite and somehow still slightly competitive. Here's a more unusual tidbit. Some Mughal emperors, particularly Akbar, encouraged intellectual discussions during such walks, inviting scholars, poets, and advisors to share ideas in informal settings. Historians still argue whether these moments were genuinely collaborative or carefully controlled displays of openness, but either way, they added a softer dimension to imperial decision-making. You notice how the emperor occasionally slows or turns his head slightly, acknowledging a speaker without fully stopping. It's a delicate balance, engaging but not lingering too long. Even conversation here follows a rhythm, like the steady flow of the garden's water channels. A light breeze passes through, stirring the leaves and carrying with it the layered scents of the garden. The courtiers pause ever so slightly, as if even the wind deserves a moment of attention. You try not to smile, but there's something quietly amusing about how seriously everyone takes the atmosphere. Imagine someone sneezing loudly right now. It would probably echo through history as a minor scandal. As you move further along, you begin to notice smaller gestures that reveal more than words. A slight bow held a fraction longer than usual, a glance exchanged between two officials, the careful way someone positions themselves just a step closer to the emperor's path. These are the subtle signals of courtly life, tiny movements that carry meaning far beyond their size. You realize that this walk isn't just about reflection or relaxation. It's also a space where relationships are maintained, where influence is gently negotiated. No one is making bold declarations, but everyone is present, watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. And yet, despite all this quiet politics, the garden never loses its calm. The sound of water continues, steady and grounding. Birds still call from the trees. The symmetry remains undisturbed, as if the environment itself keeps everything in check, reminding everyone, emperor and courtier alike, to move with care. The sunlight grows warmer now, brushing against the tops of trees and beginning to touch the pathways more fully. The marble edges of the garden glow softly, reflecting the light in gentle tones. Shadows shorten, and the world feels a little more awake. The emperor's pace slows once more, and for a moment everything seems to settle. Conversations pause, movements soften. It's not an ending, not quite, but a shift, the kind that tells you the quiet intimacy of the morning is beginning to give way to the responsibilities of the day. You remain just at the edge of it all, unnoticed, watching as the balance between stillness and duty gently begins to tilt. The light settles more confidently across the garden now, no longer tentative or pale, but warm and steady as it reaches into every corner of the charbagh. You feel it on your skin, gentle and gradual, like the morning itself is carefully unfolding rather than rushing in. The emperor's walk continues, but something has shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The stillness remains, but it's thinning, making space for the day ahead. Courtiers begin to withdraw, one by one, their movements as quiet as their arrival. No announcements, no clear signal, just a shared understanding that this part of the morning is drawing to a close. You watch as they step back along the pathways, their figures blending once more into the edges of the garden and the corridors beyond. It's a kind of disappearing act, practiced and precise. A mainstream historical detail lingers here. Mughal emperors often transitioned from these early private or semi-private moments into more formal public appearances, such as the Jaroka Darshan, where they would present themselves to the public from a balcony. That ritual, performed by rulers like Akbar, was meant to reinforce connection with the people, though historians still argue whether it was a sincere gesture of accessibility or a carefully maintained image of divine authority. You remain where you are, letting the quiet stretch just a little longer. The emperor pauses near a reflecting pool, its surface now catching the full glow of the rising sun. The water holds the image of sky and stone together, blending them into something soft and almost dreamlike. For a moment, it feels as though the garden exists both above and below, mirrored in stillness. A small ripple crosses the surface, just enough to blur the reflection, and you can't help but think how fragile even the most carefully arranged calm can be. One tiny movement and everything shifts, not dramatically, not destructively, just enough to remind you that nothing stays perfectly still for long. Here's a quieter, slightly unusual thought. Some accounts suggest that Mughal gardens were designed not only for beauty and symbolism, but also for managing temperature and airflow. The water channels and shaded layouts helped cool the surrounding spaces, creating a natural form of climate control. So while you're admiring the aesthetics, the garden is also quietly doing practical work, like a very elegant version of air conditioning. The emperor turned slightly, beginning the slow return toward the palace. There's no rush, no sudden change in pace, just a gradual redirection, like a tide gently shifting. You follow at a distance, your steps soft against the pathway, already feeling the difference between the open air of the garden and the enclosed calm waiting inside. As you pass once more by the flowering plants, their fragrance seems lighter now, touched by the warmth of the sun. The birds are more active too, their calls a little brighter, a little more frequent. The world is no longer waking, it's awake. You take one last look at the garden behind you. The symmetry, the water, the quiet order, it all remains, even as the people move on. There's something comforting about that. The idea that this space will return to stillness again tomorrow and the day after, holding the same gentle routine through time. And now, as the emperor disappears into the palace once more, you find yourself slowing, lingering just at the threshold between garden and corridor. The sounds soften again, not into silence, but into something quieter, more distant. You don't follow this time. Instead, you remain in the garden, letting the warmth settle, letting the last traces of early morning drift gently around you. The pathways feel less formal now, more like quiet places to rest than routes to be followed. The water continues its steady movement, unchanged, unbothered. You take a slow breath in and out. The air feels softer. The light feels calmer. And as you stand there, the edges of the world seem to blur just slightly, not in a dramatic way, just enough to make everything feel a little more distant, a little more dreamlike. The details that once stood out so clearly, the carved stone, the precise lines, the careful gestures, begin to fade into a gentler impression. You're no longer observing, you're simply there. The garden holds you in its quiet balance, no longer asking you to notice every detail, no longer guiding your steps. It just exists, steady and calm, like a place that doesn't need to prove anything. Your breathing slows. The sounds soften further. Even the light, now fully risen, feels less bright, more like a warm presence than something to look at. And somewhere in that stillness, you feel the weight of the morning drift away, replaced by something lighter, something quieter, like the gentle end of a thought or the beginning of sleep.